Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today I'm going to be talking about the ultimate type of UFO encounter, and that is the onboard experience. The title of today's episode is Onboard an Extraterrestrial Craft, 7 First-Hand Cases. I like this aspect of ufology because these are the kinds of cases that I think really have the most data to them, have the most potential to answer the many questions surrounding extraterrestrial contact. And the 7 cases I've chosen for you today absolutely are very extensive. In each of these cases, people were able to converse directly with the ETs and get quite a bit of information about them. So that, I think, makes these cases very important. These kinds of cases, I think, are the cutting edge of UFO research and deserve far more attention than they're getting. Now, the 7 cases I've chosen for you today cover quite a period of time, all the way from 1917 up into practically the current day. And again, come from all over the world. The 7 cases I've chosen for you today include Canada, Finland, Soviet Union, Brazil, and 3 cases in the United States, including Alaska, Alabama, and the state of Washington. These are really amazing cases. Several of them are supported by some very interesting evidence, such as landing traces or physiological effects or animal reactions and more. So this is not just people telling purely anecdotal story. There is some evidence to support these cases. Either way, they're all first-hand cases, meaning the witnesses do speak about it in their own words, and that I find particularly interesting. So let's just get started, because this is going to be a pretty long episode, I think. And the first case I want to talk about today, I call the disappearance of Annie Latu. This is a very early case. It occurred in January, or thereabouts, April of 1917 in Geenvaara, Finland. And what makes this case so interesting is that onboard encounters that predate the modern age of UFOs in the mid-1947 are exceedingly rare. And yet here we have one that's quite an early case, and it contains many of the elements we see in modern cases. At that time, the idea of being taken on board a craft and meeting with extraterrestrials was not really in the public consciousness, not in a factual way. And here we have a case which is really extensive. So I think you'll find it pretty interesting. This case comes from Finnish researcher Moritz Haitamaki, and it was published in the Nordic UFO newsletter and in the UFO Research of Finland annual report. But it actually first appeared in the newspaper Kirkki-Journalinen, and since then has been fairly widely published. This incident took place in the small village of Geenvaara, also called Alho according to some sources, west of Kirkkijoki, Finland. There does appear to be some confusion about the exact location by Lake Kankaanlampi. Others say it's Lake Ladoga. At any rate, the witness was Annie Latu, age 44. She lived with her husband in this small village and was well known to the residents there. But one day in early 1917, in the beginning of the year, January, April, she disappeared. Local villagers assumed that she had gone to visit her daughter, but upon her return, Annie said that no, she had actually been taken into a craft by strange beings. According to Annie, she was walking to her home, carrying a load of wood through the snow, and this is when her encounter began. She saw this craft. As Annie says, I spotted it just before dusk. It stood there as if it were part of the forest, yet it did not come from it. A huge metal bowl, like an upside-down sink, gleamed silently by the lakeshore. The air was still. The birds were silent. So Annie describes this object as metallic, huge, with a very smooth surface, kind of reminding her of a gigantic wash basin or a soup plate. She said it landed right next to her cottage. She could see a thin metal ladder extending from the bottom of the machine, and coming down this ladder were short little figures, no more than waist high, she said, with long arms and shiny eyes, moving in a strange way. She didn't really describe them any further than that. But again, at this time, UFOs and visitors from other planets were not really part of the public consciousness, so this never crossed her mind. But it was clear to her that these beings were not human. So she told herself, "Devils, they've come for me." Now weirdly, she felt no fear at first, just a strange silence. Then one of the beings raised its hand and pointed at her, and she heard a voice in her head saying, "Come on." And her legs, she said, seemed to move of their own will, and she found herself involuntarily walking towards the craft. At this point she did become afraid and tried to resist, but before she could, she found herself taken inside this craft. And once she was inside, she was surprised to see that it was fully lit and that the light cast no shadows. The interior of this craft was very clean, shiny and smooth, and also pleasantly warm compared to the winter weather that she had been in moments before. And inside there were many of these small little men. She said they moved very quickly. And she was also surprised that she was able to understand them. Without warning, this craft took off in perfect silence. This also surprised her, as she was used to being on noisy trains, which made a lot of noise. But when this thing moved, it was perfectly silent. She said that there were many little seats inside the craft, which also were very warm and comfortable. And she said the beings were very friendly. Now, per Annie, these little beings flew her in their craft very fast all across the planet, all over Earth, showing her many wonderful things. One of these beings appeared to be the leader, or it was he who communicated with her. Now, she wasn't sure if they were just wanting to examine her or if they were trying to teach her something, but yeah, she said they showed her many things. She saw the world from above. She described oceans, cities she had never visited before, huge mountains, and at one point they took her out into outer space, showed her the stars, which she said looked so close they were like sparkling flowers on a black background, is how she put it. So this went on for quite some time. Towards the end of the experience, the beings offered her to stay. When she heard this, Annie became filled with sadness and homesickness, and she told them no, she wanted to go back home to her normal life. And the next thing she knew, she was waking up on the road in front of her cottage where she had been taken. There was some ice in her hair, it was cold. So she went home and before long started sharing her story with the local villagers. Now these people were pretty religious, and they told her that these beings must have been little devils. So she kind of accepted that explanation because she did not know how to categorize this experience. And people really wondered about what she was saying. They thought she was kind of strange. Perhaps she had gotten a bad scare or hallucinated or dreamed the event or got a fever or was isolated as an old woman. But actually she was a very respected person in this community. And despite the skepticism of many of the people around her, she stuck to her story and told anyone who would listen, and told this story for years without any change in detail. Another interesting fact is that she became very well known in her community for her clairvoyance and her ability to read palms and her psychic abilities. How amazing is that? All the details that Annie describes with her encounter are details we hear over and over again. Telepathy, the interior of the craft being very well lit with no discernible light source, being taken on a tour around the world or up into space. Very, very interesting. Also very interesting to me is that the ETs offered to let her stay with them. She, of course, declined the offer, but a really interesting case because, again, at that time, people were just not talking about this. And although there were quite a few skeptics in terms of the people in her village, she stuck to her guns. She absolutely insisted her experience was entirely real. I also find it interesting that she became very well known for her psychic abilities clairvoyance, soothsaying, as some put it. So that is another pattern we see with contactees, and it's absolutely prominent with that witness, Annie Lattu. So now let's move to the next case. I found this one to be particularly poignant and so unusual. I have not heard a case quite like this. There are many details, of course, that are quite familiar, but as always, there's always some details that are unique. And as you'll see, this case definitely has some high strangeness to it. I call this one, I Was Lifted into the Sky. This occurred in June of 1953 in the small town of Phenix City, Alabama. This case is virtually unknown, but I think it's an important case that deserves more attention just because it has such weird details. And again, really poignant. This first-hand eyewitness account comes from a gentleman by the name of Derek. That is a pseudonym. He wants to remain anonymous. It was the summer of 1953, and he lived on Cedar Lane in Phenix City, Alabama. At the time, that was a very small dirt road, quite isolated, very rural. It was afternoon, and Derek was only 5 years old. He was walking home after spending some time at the local market, and as he walked down the north side of Cedar, he was very careful to walk on the far side of the street, as far from a nearby ravine as possible. Because as it turned out, while walking home on 2 earlier occasions, he had been frightened by the appearance of a, quote, large, hairy, ape-like man, very much like a Bigfoot, which was wandering among the kudzu that grew in that area. And as Derek says, although the creature never threatened me, I was afraid to get too close. So it was shortly after passing this ravine where he had seen this Bigfoot-like creature that his UFO encounter began. And I'll just quote Derek directly. As he says, I was halfway across the dirt road when I was struck in the forehead by a bright, narrow beam of light from above. The beam was less than 2 inches in diameter. It made no sound, nor had any feeling, but it was amazingly bright to be seen during a mid-afternoon. I gazed skyward, and I saw a large gray disk suspended very high over the backyard of my home. Immediately, I was lifted up into the sky at very high speed. Now, Derek didn't feel any sensation of being lifted. Instead, it felt almost to him like he was falling, except for the direction was definitely upwards and directly into the craft. Now, from this point, his memory does get a little hazy, but he distinctly remembers being taken into this craft into a strange room and seeing extraterrestrial beings. As Derek says, my memory is clouded about the ensuing details. I seem to recall being greeted by at least 3 persons inside the craft. I can't describe what they looked like. I'm assuming they did not look like monsters because I did not panic. I recall being on a table and something sharp was being stuck into my left nostril. It wasn't painful, but it was uncomfortable. I also recall being told it was a beneficial procedure. They weren't speaking words. We were communicating via thoughts. I was also told not to tell anybody what happened. They also told me that the hairy creature in the ravine would not harm me. The next thing I recall, I was inside my house, standing behind a sheer curtain in the parlor. I don't know how I got there. So Derek did not tell anybody, especially because the weird events had really only just begun. That night, something incredibly bizarre happened that he knew nobody would believe. As Derek says, that night, I woke up in the middle of the night and saw the hairy creature standing next to my bed. He was so tall his head bumped against the light bulb that was hanging from the ceiling. And next to him was a shorter, similarly hairy woman holding a baby creature. The hair on the adults lay flat on their bodies. The hair on the baby was fuzzy and stood away from its body. Suddenly, the baby jumped up from its mother's arms and bounced on my bed. She reached down to pick him up, and as it was being lifted, the small creature peed on my bed. The father seemed perturbed by the incident, and the 3 of them exited my room, went through the parlor, and out the front door. I never saw any hairy creatures again. So yes, this is quite bizarre. Derek knew this, and he did his best to forget these incidents. But there were several strange after effects from these encounters. For a period of about 10 years following this, Derek suffered from boils on his body and chronic nosebleeds. He also began having many out-of-body experiences at night and would fly all around the house and the area where he lived. Now, sometimes when he returned from his astral projection experiences, he said he would slam into his body so hard he would physically bounce off the bed. Thankfully, following high school, the nosebleeds slowed down and eventually stopped. He grew up, he began to work in the military as a soldier, later as a commercial fisherman, and a pest control technician. And he said he always enjoyed really excellent health. As he says, "I was an extremely healthy person. I did not have a primary doctor. I was never sick. The only time I saw a doctor was when I had injuries." Now, decades later in 2005, Derek, now around age 57, began to be bothered by something like a pimple in the inside of his left nostril. Over the next 4 years, it continued to irritate him. And suddenly, it sprouted, quote, "something that resembled a stiff hair." So he tried using scissors to cut it, but the thing would not cut. So one day he just grabbed a pair of tweezers and yanked it out. And as Derek says, it was not a hair. Removing that thing was very painful. It looked like a section of thick monofilament from a fishing line, a 40 to 50 pound test line. It was more than an inch long, although less than a quarter inch had been visible when I removed it. I tossed it into the trash. So this is an apparent implant. Now, 4 years after this, Derek was diagnosed and treated for throat cancer. He barely survived, but he did. It was 2 years after that, in 2015, that he decided to make an official report about his childhood encounters decades earlier. And as Derek says, "I never spoke of these things to anyone. I tried to forget they even happened. There is nothing special about me. I grew up in an area and an era when things like UFOs were not even discussed. It wasn't until much later in life that I became curious. I'm filing this report because things are only now becoming more clear in my memory about unexplained things that happened in my life. I am curious to know whether or not I may have had contact with alien beings." As you can see, in many ways, that's your standard case of someone being taken on board and examined. And yet, really unusual details with the Bigfoot connection. I also found it interesting that this witness reported having excellent health for most of his life. This is a pattern we see in so many cases. There's also, of course, the implant. That is another thing we see quite often. So, yeah, a pretty amazing case by all means. All right, now we move to another very interesting case, which I call "I Was Being Watched." This one occurred in 1961 in a suburb of Alta Vista. This is in Canada, and a super interesting case. This witness reports quite a few experiences throughout her life, but as we often see, beginning in early childhood. In this case, she did use hypnosis to recover some of her memories, but certainly did have some conscious recollections of encounters as well. But another fascinating case that deserves to be well known. This case comes from UFO researcher and author Robert Colombo and was published in his book UFOs Over Canada. The witness is a lady by the name of Joyce Halfin, aka Joyce Aldrich. She's a journalist, an artist, and a musician. It was back in 1961, when she was 6 years old, that her encounter occurred. She was living in a row house on Eastern Drive in an Ottawa suburb called Alta Vista, not far from Rockcliffe Air Force Base. You can see it here. One evening, she woke up and had a feeling that she was being watched. She looked to the window and saw what she called spacemen. They looked like figures with large helmets and visors. The next thing she knew, she was suddenly flying high up in the air, looking down on her housing complex. She saw a big bright light, and that was all she could remember. At that time, she wrote it off as some kind of dream, but she never forgot about it. She always wondered about it because it definitely was not a dream. And later in life, she started having more encounters, so she finally decided to go under regressive hypnosis. And she recalled that she was actually taken on board a craft at that time. And as Joyce says, the spacemen, who I thought were wearing large helmets with visors, ended up having large egg-shaped heads and large insect-like eyes. They came through the wall of my home, and one of them picked me up. We then floated up to the ceiling, passed through it, and through the roof, where I remember looking down at a brightly lit area. When I looked up, I saw a large circular craft ringed with 2 sets of lights. We rose to the center area of the craft, and a portal opened into a bay area. There were other beings standing there, wearing different apparel, who were slightly taller than my companions, who were only 4 to 5 feet in height. I was taken to what at first looked like an elevator. A door opened, and we entered a very dark room. I could still see the aliens. They moved with the precise, graceful movements of a praying mantis, deftly moving their large heads on delicate necks. So Joyce stared at them in wonder, and she was particularly impressed by their very large eyes. And at this point, a telepathic exchange followed, during which the ETs explained that their eyes were in some ways insect-like, but where we see only the surface level of things, they can do an in-depth analysis and actually see the cellular structures of things and beyond. After this, an oval door opened into a corridor, and Joyce said she was led to a room where there were 3 or 4 more beings standing behind a kind of hospital gurney or table, and they placed her on top of it. And as Joyce says, I was told they were going to check my eyes. First they put a dark cloth over them and playfully lifted it off an eye and then the other. Then they took an instrument to retract my lids so they could have a closer look. A large machine, which resembled an X-ray machine, was held over my eyes. There were 2 long tubes attached to it, and the aliens said they were going to try to feed information into my eyes to see how much could be implanted into the brain. Soon after the procedure began, I got a terrible headache and asked them to stop. They did, and I was ushered to a small stool to sit for a while. And that was pretty much the end of the encounter. Shortly later, she was brought back to her bedroom in the same manner she was taken. But later, she would have other encounters. A major one occurred on June 29, 1989, when she woke up to see 4 beings in her bedroom, each about 7 feet tall, with extremely thin arms and legs and very small heads. She really couldn't recall anything else consciously, but under hypnosis, she did remember that she was again taken up through the roof of her house into a sort of boomerang-shaped craft. The ETs told her it was a, quote, light ship, that they used light to travel interdimensionally, and they went into some detail about this. They told her also that the current Earth space program is doomed to failure, but that eventually physicists would learn how to use light to travel interdimensionally. They told her that humans are largely stuck in the 3rd dimension, and that we think that death is the only way to reach a higher dimension, which they said is not true. They talked about the tunnel that near-death experiencers see, and as Joyce says, the light at the end of the tunnel is actually a portal to another dimension. The aliens said that we can pass through the portal without dying, and that we have to shake off our old ideas about space, time, and death. So it sounds like they're talking about astral projection, which anyone can do. Now, Joyce has since learned that many other people in her family have had encounters. One evening, her young son described what she believes was a UFO sighting. Her mother told her that she used to see glowing golden orbs entering her bedroom all the time, and she also reported a wide variety of psychic experiences, premonitions, bilocation experiences, and once actually levitated right in front of her, showed her that she could levitate. Also, her uncle told her that back in June of 1959, while he was driving to work down Empress Street, he saw a bright cylindrical object covered with flashing lights hovering in the sky. It then took off really fast and was gone. Joyce does report having many other psychic experiences, and she later hosted her own podcast about arts, entertainment, and of course, UFOs and the paranormal. There are lots of details in that case that I found particularly fascinating. How the ETs described to her that they travel interdimensionally, I found that fascinating. Also fascinating to me was how she described the history of UFO encounters in her family, and especially with her mother, who reportedly levitated. That is super interesting to me because I've heard that with quite a few contactees. And of course, the witness describes how she herself had some amazing psychic experiences. Really, really interesting details in that case. So now let's move to the next one, which is somewhat well known. I hadn't heard of it before, but it's a fascinating case which comes out of Russia. That alone I think is important because we don't get a lot of cases coming out of this area. I call this next one, It Actually Happened to Me. This was in June of 1978 at Lake Pyrogovsko in the Soviet Union. And what's interesting about this case is that the witness is a high-ranking Soviet military officer. So a good, credible witness. But some of the details he describes are absolutely unusual. I've never heard them before. Some, of course, are very familiar. What's really interesting is he does claim that he was taken to apparently another planet. So that alone makes this case very extensive. And yeah, like in all of these cases that I'm presenting today, he was able to converse directly with the ETs. So I think you'll find it a pretty interesting case. This next very interesting case comes from Russian ufologist Nikita A. Shny. The witness is a high-ranking officer in the Soviet Army by the name of Anatoly Malyshev. It was one day in late May or early June 1978. Anatoly was walking near Lake Pyrogovsko. Now I couldn't find the exact location, so I'm not exactly sure where this is. But according to Anatoly, without warning, two very unusual-looking men grabbed him by the arms. Both were dressed, he said, in a very strange, kind of dull-colored, cellophane-like garments. Anatoly had trouble remembering what their faces looked like, and he said he was overcome by fear. Then the beings began to communicate with him, saying, quote, "We'd like to talk to you. It'll take just a few seconds. Everything we'll talk about will be erased and you'll forget it." Now, per Anatoly, the men didn't actually say these words. As he says, I could feel their words, and I, in my turn, didn't talk, but thought, and they understood me. So he's describing telepathy. And hearing these beings communicate with him, Anatoly's fear lifted, and as he says, I felt lighthearted and free. He sensed that these men were from another world, and told them, again through telepathy, that he had nothing against talking with representatives from another civilization. And the next thing he knew, he was inside what appeared to be a craft. As Anatoly says, the next moment, I remember myself being at a table in a dome-like room. It was bright inside. The walls were bright and white, but I can't say where the light came from, as I didn't notice lamps of any kind. There were two figures sitting at a table, and I can visualize them only hazily. Part of the room opposite me was in the dark. I could just see some small tables with buttons and a big screen like a TV set. So after hearing that these beings were planning on erasing his memory of the event, Anatoly became determined to remember. So, he says, I had to try one of our old customs. And he told them, it's a rule here to celebrate such important meetings with a drink. So the beings brought him a sort of spherical shaped glass tumbler with a liquid that looked a little bit like lemonade, but when he tasted it, he said it had an almost salty taste, and Anatoly told them that such occasions should be celebrated with a stronger liquor. Now they seemed interested and somewhat puzzled by this request, and asked him for further information about this. Anatoly was intelligent. He knew about the chemistry of alcohol and told them he could write it down. So they directed him to stand by the wall and told him to write it there. As Anatoly says, With slight surprise, I began to write with my finger on the wall, and quite clear traces were left there. It was just like writing on misted glass or on black velvet. I drew the formula and structure of alcohol for them, and one of them said, "We'll make it right away," and disappeared into the gloom. He then reappeared with a glass in his hand and gave it to me. Naturally, Anatoly was quite surprised by this and asked them, "How is it that such a highly developed civilization does not use something like this?" And one of them replied, again telepathically, "Maybe if we used it, we would never have been so highly developed." Anatoly felt like they were kind of joking with him, but he had more questions. So he asked them, "Why don't you help Earth's people in their struggle against evil?" They asked him, "What evil?" Anatoly told them, "Against poverty, fascism, the rich, and so on." And their response was that they would have to help the poor people and the rich, and that it would ultimately be difficult to know whom to help, and that they have elected not to interfere and are here just to watch us. Now he asked them where they came from, and they told him that they were from another planet in another stellar system. He asked them many things, and they answered all his questions. Anatoly estimates that this conversation lasted for about 3 hours, but he was only able to remember small portions of it. Now at some point during the encounter, the ETs told him to step outside of the craft as they wanted to put on a, quote, flying show for him. So he stepped outside, apparently still on Earth, though this isn't perfectly clear, and he watched the craft rise up 300 feet in altitude, and it then proceeded to change shape from a classic disc, he said, to spherical, and then seemed almost to open up like a peeled orange. Then it went back to a spherical shape and finally a disc shape again. He was brought back into the craft, which now went into outer space, and per Anatoly, they actually flew to the far side of the moon, and the ETs showed him what appeared to be some kind of alien base there. They then flew him to their home planet. They told him, per Anatoly, that their planet was 3 light years from Earth. That's what he says they told him. They landed on a non-Earth planet at some type of what looked like a spaceport, because he saw other craft landed on the ground, disc-shaped craft. Stepping out of the craft he was in promptly disappeared. Anatoly says that this area was composed of some unknown material. He said the plants and trees definitely looked foreign to him, not of Earth. The sky was silver gray, bright, but he did not see any sun. And the ETs walked him over to a large screen, about 10 by 15 feet, and this screen showed an image of a dark-complexioned man who seemed to study Anatoly for a few moments. The ETs then guided Anatoly back to the original craft, which had reappeared, and he was given, he says, a 40-minute long ride back to Earth. Now, towards the end of the experience, one of the ETs told him, "We'll now erase the memory of everything we had talked about." And the man walked to what looked to Anatoly like sort of a control panel, pressing buttons which caused pulses to jump about on this computer-like screen. And they seemed to be having difficulty. Anatoly asked them what was the problem, and they told him that they were having trouble locating which part of his brain had been affected by the conversation. And finally they just turned to him and instructed him to not let anyone know that he was able to remember this experience. And as Anatoly says, "The next instant, I suddenly realized I was standing almost in the same place where I had been before meeting the aliens. The sun was in the same position, at the same angle, and the clouds seemed the same. It was as though only seconds had passed, and everything had happened in a profound sleep." So he had an hours-long encounter, and they took him back to that same moment in time. He went home and told his wife, who advised him not to talk to anyone about this, or he would end up in a madhouse, or worse, jail. But the next day, Anatoly was still very impressed by his encounter, so he talked about it at work. And as Anatoly says, "During a break in the smoke room, I began to talk about the incident. The end of my story was accompanied by the loud laughter of those who had been listening to me. So this persuaded him to keep silent. But as he says, I'm pretty sure it actually happened to me." He did notice a few strange after effects. Immediately following the encounter, after he left this craft, he realized that his clothes were fresher and cleaner than they had been before. He also tried to write down his account and found himself physically unable to do it, and could only relate the experience verbally to researchers, which he did not long after the encounter occurred. Now, researchers were very impressed by his case and his honesty. They traveled back to the location and investigated the landing site. They didn't find anything unusual. They also brought in a couple of psychics who were separately able to pinpoint the exact location of the encounter without being told where it was. They questioned Anatoly in depth and at one point subjected him to hypnotic regression in the hopes of obtaining new details. But Anatoly told the same exact story under hypnosis. Now, those who knew Anatoly considered him very honest and sincere. He had no prior knowledge of or interest in the UFO subject. Anatoly, in fact, agreed to take a lie detector test, which he passed, so investigators were ultimately utterly convinced that he was telling the truth. And as Nikita Schnee, the primary investigator, writes, "I would like to stress that all the facts related in this case, incredible as they are facts. All the events described actually took place and are not products of the contactee's imagination. It has been proved quite convincingly by the examination of the witness himself as well as the landing site of the UFO. Our finding was that the case was neither hoax nor hallucination." I like that case because it was very thoroughly investigated. The witness is quite credible. He had no need to use hypnosis. It was fully consciously recalled. And just an amazing case in so many different ways regarding what he was told by the ETs, him asking them to help solve our problems and them explaining that, no, we can't do this. This is a theme we see in quite a few onboard encounters. So yeah, super interesting stuff and an amazing case. Now let's move to the next one. This one is quite well known, I think, in the country of its origin, Brazil. Huge thanks to Chico for referring this case to me. I found it super fascinating because, wow, this one was very well authenticated, very well researched, has an enormous amount of evidence to it, including actual photographs. So it's almost undeniable that something really profound happened to this gentleman. This occurred on May 16, 1979 in Baipendi, Brazil. And again, this is an onboard experience where a gentleman had long conversations with the ETs and was shown many things, and I think it's an important case. This case comes from Dr. Liberajara Franco Rodriguez, Maria Jose Pereira, and several others investigated it. It was published in the Brazilian UFO publication SBEDV and in several other publications. It became quite well known. It took place in a rural area near Baipendi. This is in Minas Gerais, Brazil. And the witness's name is Arlindo Gabriel dos Santos. He was a young farmer with very little education. It was around 10:30 a.m. on May 16, 1979. Arlindo was hunting in a wooded area with his two friends, Jose da Silva and Oliveira Prudente. They decided to split up and each went hunting in different directions. So now alone, Arlindo saw what he thought at first was a lightning flash. This was strange because it was a clear sky, and it was shortly later that he came upon a clearing in the woods and was shocked to see a strange, kind of glowing rectangular shaped object, only about 4 feet tall, coming in for a landing about 550 feet away. Now in the past, he and his father had seen some unusual lights. This was 4 years earlier while horseback riding, but those were off in the distance, and this was close, so he had some idea about UFOs. And Arlindo describes this object. He said, quote, "It was white and shaped like a post, and 2.5 palms wide and 1.5 meters tall. On top of it was a sphere that blinked red and white. I took my camera out and took a photo of it." Suddenly it vanished before my eyes. Now curious, he walked over to the area to investigate, and this is when he saw a second object descending. And as Arlindo says, this one was shaped like a top, and it had like a little fan turning around on top of it. It was shaped like a spear on the bottom, and that stuck in the ground. A moment later, I heard a sound like sh 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 sh, and it disappeared in a cloud of smoke. I took a picture of the smoke. So he stepped closer, and this is when a third object came down. And as Arlindo says, it looked like a wine barrel, red and white, and about 1.5 meters tall. It had a propeller spinning slowly on top, larger than the one on the other object. It came down, wobbling from side to side, and then put down a leg, like a stand for a TV set. So this was really freaking him out. And then a fourth object appeared. This was much larger and obviously a craft. As Arlindo says, this one was white like snow and shaped like a large egg lying on its side. There was a little window on each side of a little wing that looked like fins on a fish. When it was 1.5 meters from the ground, it stood still, hovering, and 4 legs came down to the ground. So amazed, Arlindo lay down on the ground and attempted to photograph it. But at this moment the object sent a beam of light at him, which irritated his eyes. He became very much terrified, dropped his camera, jumped up, and attempted to run away. As Arlindo says, I was out of my mind with fear. I was very afraid. I couldn't see, and I ran off. But I didn't get more than 2 or 3 steps away when something like a magnet caught me. I couldn't move. I got very nervous and scared. I couldn't feel myself. Then I saw 2 men at the egg-shaped object wearing black helmets and coveralls. There were visors in their helmets. I wasn't feeling very well, and I couldn't make out any features behind the visors. On their backs they had small drum-shaped packs with tubes that were attached to the helmets. They were wearing gloves, and the coveralls covered their entire bodies. The 2 men came to me, and each took me by the arm, and I got even more troubled and frightened. So at this point Arlindo screamed out to them, "For the love of God, let me go." Now these 2 little figures responded in his native Portuguese, quote, "In the name of God, we are all brothers. We don't harm anybody. We only want some more information." Now he said the voices seemed to come from a box-like device on the beings' backs, and that these voices were low and deep. They led him towards the craft. As he got close to it, he could feel an intense cold surrounding this craft. He saw another figure wearing a helmet standing next to a ladder leading into the craft. This figure was looking back and forth, almost like a guard. This figure asked him if he had seen the, quote, Zerka. Arlindo did not understand this word and asked them what it was, and they said it was a communications device which they had apparently lost. He asked them where they had come from, and they told him, "We come from the other side of the mountain." According to other translations, they said, "We come from the other side of the coast." So they asked him at this point if he was educated, and he said no, he'd never been to school, wasn't very smart. One of the short men took his hand, which he said felt very smooth and cool, and led him inside the craft. And as Arlindo says, as soon as I got inside, everything changed. I felt I was in another world. It had a nasty smell, like dust on the roads. I saw 2 other men sitting in armchairs, chairs like a dentist, and they appeared to be typing. They stood up and others came and they started talking to each other. I couldn't understand what they were saying. So in some of the descriptions he said it was actually a musty smell. There was equipment there that he couldn't understand what it looked like. He said their speech really sounded kind of like a lot of hissing. Inside, the air was very cool, very pleasant, he said. It was a large circular room about 25 feet wide with a dome-shaped ceiling. A bright light was coming from the center of this dome. On the walls he saw a few what looked to him like colored lights or buttons. And these men inside this craft, he said, looked human, but had large slanted eyes, very thin noses, large mouths that went from one side of their face to the other, and were also wearing dark, tight-fitting uniforms. So the machinery inside he couldn't describe. It looked totally foreign to him. Another weird detail is he said once he stepped inside, he seemed to forget everything about his own life. Now, moments later, a female figure came into the room, which he described as somewhat heavy-set, good-looking, with tan skin and long, fine white hair. She was wearing a white uniform and gloves, but did not have a helmet on. He did see that she was wearing strange earpieces. She and one of the men, he put his hand on Arlindo's shoulder. They led Arlindo through a short corridor into another room, which was not much larger than a bathroom. One of them pressed what looked like a button on the wall, and at this point a large marble-looking object, shaped like a large refrigerator, rose up. Per Arlindo, it was 9 feet wide, 4 feet tall, and it had 2 screens on it. At this point, the female figure took a wand-like device and pointed it at this object, at which point Arlindo saw colorful images on these screens. And as Arlindo says, the upper half of the box lit up, and a round screen like a TV appeared. She pointed the wand at it and said, "This is the sun, this is the moon, and this is where we are." She pressed a button and the light went off, and then another circle on the right side of the box lit up in the same manner. A similar picture appeared, and she said, "Here is the earth, the sun, and the moon." And the earth turned and turned in the picture until it vanished. Then a little spot appeared on the top left and grew larger and larger. This was their country. She said, "This is where we are. We come from there and return in only a few hours." So Arlindo had a little bit of a hard time understanding what he was looking at. It was very confusing to him. He wasn't sure if these images he was being shown were from Earth or another planet. The lady proceeded to talk about the rotation of Earth and how it affected their ability to travel. Then they led him back to the first room. At this point, the male humanoid took off his helmet, revealing a pretty much human-looking face, but different. Per Arlindo, his ears were pressed to the side of his head, had no real forehead, his nose was more sunken than a normal person's, a very round head, and without moving his mouth, he told Arlindo, "We are made of the same substance, the same blood, and we live of the same kind of world as you do." According to another translation, we do the same kind of work that you do. Now, as Arlindo says, and I quote, "I was very, very scared, and I saw the door open and I tried to escape. The man said, 'You can go down now, but protect your eyes.' So I went down the ladder and ran across the field. When I got off, I couldn't move freely. I felt restricted. Then when I got to the end of the field, they freed me. When I turned around, the 2 objects had vanished. I was feeling ill and nauseated and dizzy. I called for my friends, and they found me and gave me water to drink." Now, the duration of this encounter, Arlindo estimates, was about 2 hours. Afterwards, he was extremely thirsty. His eyes were swollen. He was suffering from headaches after the incident, which persisted for a few days. But he did also notice an apparent healing. Since he was a young child, he suffered a sort of dermatitis condition with itchy white spots on his skin. But after this encounter, these spots were gone and never returned. Later, after he recovered, they went back to look for his bag. He had a bag of food and other items, but they were unable to find it. Now, on May 28th, he and his brother Jairo returned to the spot and were able to find 4 imprints on the ground where the object had landed. You can see them here. Each of these 4 imprints were filled with small holes. And later, they did find Arlindo's bag in an area which they had already thoroughly searched. So it looks like it was put back there. Even more so because it now had strange hieroglyph-like symbols on it, which weren't there before. They looked like they were drawn on. And according to the reports on this, they were somewhat similar to ancient Hebrew characters or Phoenician writing, Egyptian Aramaic. There were many attempts to decipher this writing, and they mostly ended up failing. Though one researcher, Ricardo Ferreira Arantes, says that he was able to translate it, and that it is a message of upcoming calamity on Earth, and, quote, "The developed races of space have the authority to lay the foundations of universal fraternity." So I don't know about that, but certainly interesting. This case was very thoroughly researched by numerous researchers over a period of months. One of the researchers, Dr. Rodriguez, writes, quote, "We checked thoroughly into his character and background, and we found him to be totally honest and sincere, and not the kind of man who would make up a story like this. We talked to many people who knew Arlindo, and everybody speaks highly of him. We are convinced Arlindo's case is true, and that what he says happened really did happen." Thank you again, Chico, for referring that case to me. I found it super fascinating. The witness is so obviously sincere. It's really the kind of case that's hard to deny. And it's the kind of case that I think we can learn a lot from. It's so interesting how many different types of humanoids there are out there. And his descriptions are in some ways unique. But it's clear to me that we all do share a common heritage. The ETs pretty much told this to the witness, which is another detail that I find particularly fascinating, because that does turn up quite a bit. Just an amazing case in so many different ways. Now let's move to another case, which I'm almost certain you haven't heard of. It has not received any real publicity. I call this one, "We Are Just Measuring You." This one occurred on May 28, 1991 in Burien, Washington. And it's a pretty standard case in some ways, but has some really important details to it. It doesn't stand alone, too. There's other cases that have occurred in this same area, which is not very large, but I think you'll find it really compelling. The witness in this case is Susan. That's a pseudonym. She is elected to be anonymous. And she had a few UFO sightings in her life, but it was an encounter on May 28, 1991 that changed everything. It started at 10 p.m. when her pet German Shepherd dog started growling and staring outside at the deck, and then ran down the stairs to the basement, making low, defensive, warning growls, and then ran back up to the sliding door by the outside deck and started growling again. Now, Susan's home was located on the edge of a forested park in Burien, Washington. It goes down to Puget Sound. You can see the exact area here. She had recently seen a little family of raccoons behind her house, and she assumed that they were the cause of her dog's concern. So she didn't think much of it. She checked outside but didn't see anything. Now, strangely, she doesn't remember going to sleep that night. The next thing she remembers is waking up in her bed to see a very intense bright light outside her bedroom window. And I'll just quote Susan directly, as she says, "I remember thinking, why are the police out there? And what are they after that they are shining their spotlights on my window? But I didn't hear sirens or radio or dogs barking or people talking. I peeked outside, and the next thing I know, I was lying down on a bed or table. I saw 5 beings with very big dark eyes that reminded me of insect eyes, with a big head and slender bodies, no mouth, a tiny nose protrusion, and they communicated through my mind. One of them touched my forehead, and the other 2 were checking my stomach, while the other 2 observed. The one by my head seemed to talk to me from my mind. He told me, they are just measuring me. A bluish beam above a bright light source scanned my body, similar to a hospital scan. The next thing Susan knew, it was dawn and she was waking up back in bed. For the first half of the day, she felt somewhat lightheaded, and it was 28 years after the encounter that she decided to report it to MUFON. Now, at that time, Burien had a population of about 28,000 people to only 10 square miles. Back in 1968, actually, another encounter occurred in Burien, also involving humanoids. It was on October 10, around 4 a.m., as a different couple drove down First Avenue South, just south of Seattle. You can see it here. It was still dark at that hour. Now, the woman was 5 months pregnant, and I'll just quote her directly because she describes this very interesting encounter with humanoids. As she says, "I noticed a very bright light to the right of me behind a grove of trees as we drove down the road towards the Bar S packing plant. I turned, and I saw a large cylinder-shaped object hovering on the edge of a cliff behind a grove of trees, with a very bright light emitting from a brightly lit window within the object. It made absolutely no noise. It appeared to be stationary, hovering on the edge of the hillside, motionless, and the size of a football field. I became frightened, and as I stared at the object, I saw 4 entities with white, egg-shaped heads, large black eyes, and a small slit for a mouth. They were dressed in black uniforms. They communicated telepathically to me somehow, saying, "Don't be afraid. We are just watching." At that point, I turned to my husband and screamed, "Look! Look!" When we turned in the direction of the craft, it had silently and completely vanished. Since that experience, I continue to feel at times that I am being watched and observed on occasion. It was an eerie feeling. I have told no one about this experience as it sounds so incredible. How could one believe me? How amazing is that? Another onboard experience which follows the main pattern of people being taken on board and physically examined. Totally consciously recalled, no need for regressive hypnosis here. And it wasn't a particularly traumatic encounter. The ETs just told her, we're measuring you. So that is super interesting to me. I know that it's very scary for a lot of people to have these experiences. But if you look at these cases very closely, you'll see that it does not look like the ETs are intentionally trying to harm or hurt or scare people. No evidence that they're trying to take over. It's quite obvious to me that they're very concerned about our planet. This is what they've said over and over again. So yeah, these cases I think are so important in that regard because they really do answer the questions about who are these guys, why are they here, where do they come from, what are they doing on this planet. We have enough cases now, a big enough database, that I think we've got really good answers to all of these questions. And here's another case. There's always another case. And I call this one, I Couldn't Look Away. This occurred on September 2nd, 2021, very recent, in Wasilla, Alaska. Really interesting and again, very poignant case. For some reason, this one just really kind of hit me in the heart center. This gentleman had such an amazing encounter, and he describes it in such amazing detail. And I think you'll find it a really interesting case. It was shortly after midnight on September 2nd, 2021, and Andrew, this is a pseudonym, was outside his home in Wasilla, Washington, and he was splitting wood for his fireplace. He usually performed this task late at night due to his job, and he was transporting a wheelbarrow full of cut wood to his front porch and stacking it there. This is when he looked up and saw a, quote, striking glowing object. He said it was bright gold, hovering in the northeastern section of the sky, and the second he saw it, he became utterly transfixed. As Andrew says, I found myself unable to look away. I didn't feel a pressure of any sort on my body. I just couldn't look away. Quite literally. Words fail me, so please accept my best attempt. It felt like I wasn't allowed to disengage. It reminded me of the feeling I got once when I was bluff charged by a bear. A feeling that something was happening, that was going to happen, regarding whether or not I wanted it to. Looking away was not something my body would have allowed, due to some kind of instinctual process. So he's staring at this thing. The object quickly became brighter, and Andrew could now see that it looked almost diamond-shaped. It was emitting tentacles of thick, neon-like lightning. And as Andrew says, it was absolutely stunning, was somehow beautiful. And this is where I started to come to terms with the fact that something very strange was happening. It hovered in position for a moment, and then traveled at a very slow speed in my direction, stopping to hover over my neighbor's property. It was at this point that Andrew began to hear a sound like, quote, fuzzy whispers in his head. He said it was kind of like a deep static, almost subaudible, but it got slowly louder and clearer and evolved, as Andrew says, quote, into a whisper of what I can only describe as information. Now I'll just quote Andrew directly, as he says, I was receiving a message that, without a clear language, told me to stay calm, while simultaneously bombarding me with so much mathematical information that I was almost physically sick and nauseous from it. It was like having a math stroke, layers of information. That shifted to a low sound that made me very nauseous, and I was suddenly watching my body watch the object as a second me was drawn into it. The brightness of the vessel gave way as I got very close, about 10 to 15 feet. I was seeing an enormous golden-skinned craft with 0 lines or rivets. The sound completely ceased when I entered this area. I was pulled into an opening in the lower half of the diamond. So Andrew could now see that this craft had a dome on top. He was pulled inside of it, and he immediately got sick and puked. He was then confronted by 3 short gray ETs with dark eyes. He said they were mumbling to each other with what he perceived as excitement. He started to feel a strange pressure on his back. This caused him to lose consciousness briefly. He woke up what felt like moments later to find himself lying on a sort of table as a wave of light swept over him, scanning his body. And as Andrew says, I remember being physically examined by 2 of the gray beings, but not harshly. They almost constantly mumbled during the encounter. I could barely hear it, but what I could hear was indecipherable. It sounded like a Middle Eastern dialect being mumbled through a tube. The next thing Andrew knew, he was back on the ground where he first saw this craft. He estimates he was inside for about 15 minutes. This craft was still in the sky, but it now started to travel a, quote, very strange, seemingly random pattern for maybe 15 seconds towards Anchorage and made absolutely no noise. He was still hearing this strange, staticky, whispering sound, but as soon as the craft moved out of view, that also disappeared. Andrew immediately sat down on the ground, and he says he cried for several minutes. But then he composed himself. His wife, who is disabled, was in the bedroom. She didn't see anything. He went inside, and he didn't tell her for some time, because he knew that if he just blurted out what happened, it would sound like madness. And as Andrew says, I cried several times that morning, and the next day, and I have an emotional reaction every time I try to remember or recount it. I eventually told her, his wife, a portion of it, but I'm still terrified to tell her or anyone else about it. I had decided to just keep it to myself. 2 months later, he did finally report the encounter to both NUFORC and MUFON. The head of NUFORC encouraged him to contact the media, but Andrew declined because, as he says, I most certainly did not care to be the subject of a local news story about UFOs in such a small place. Wasilla is not a large town. It has about 10,000 people, but as it turns out, it does have quite a few sightings. In fact, another report given to MUFON involves a Wasilla man who says that he and at least one other witness saw what looked like a star in the sky. Suddenly it zoomed down, hovered 5 feet off the ground, and began to pulse in brightness. And as the witness says, after we watched it for maybe 2 minutes, it slowly went down the road. We decided to go after it. That's when we saw a yellow saucer-shaped thing appear over the power lines near where I live. The yellow craft literally appeared and disappeared right before my eyes. It then appeared maybe 100 feet away, and then white orbs began falling out from underneath it. I watched as the orbs would surround my neighbor's house. They would turn off all the lights in and around the house. Then they would light everything up. It looked like the lights were searching the house, and then they would move in. We watched that for maybe 15 minutes. So that's an interesting case, and Andrew is certainly not the only Wasilla resident who believes that they have been taken on board a craft and examined by ETs. Consider this next case completely separate, which occurred to the lady by the name of Jennifer, again a pseudonym. She was 9 years old in November of 1986. She had just been put to bed, but being a night owl, she remained awake and was watching the stars through her windows when she suddenly noticed an unusually bright orange star. And after a few minutes, it started to move, and she realized that, yeah, this was definitely not a star. As Jennifer says, As it got closer, it was giving off a lot of heat, like the sun. The next thing I remember, I was on a metal table, not strapped down, but I couldn't move a bit, as if I was being restrained. They surrounded the table. I was screaming, and all of a sudden my voice wasn't coming out of my mouth, but it was inside my head, and so loud. So Jennifer stopped screaming as these beings began to talk to her telepathically. She did not describe what they looked like, but as Jennifer says, they proceeded to poke and prod me through my belly button and between my toes. They seemed to be trying to soothe me by stroking my forehead, like my mother did when I didn't feel good. The next thing she knew, she was back in bed, soaking wet, as if she had jumped into a pool. She immediately ran and told her mother. Her mother believed her and was a little freaked out. In fact, it was an event that they would often talk about but could never fully explain. Years later, Jennifer was watching TV and saw a segment about a huge craft that was seen over Alaska in November 1986. This was around the exact time of her own encounter. And as Jennifer says, I was frozen in shock. I looked at my husband and said, "That's it. That's the UFO that took me." So that case doesn't have a whole lot of detail to it, the case involving Andrew, but certainly fascinating the way he describes it. And you can see it affected him so profoundly. Immediately after this encounter, he breaks down crying, is very scared to tell anybody. This is a pattern we see quite often. It's very difficult sometimes to process these experiences. But he did remember it fully consciously. Truly amazing. Also very interesting is that there were other people seeing humanoids in this town, which again isn't that big. So there you go, another amazing case of somebody taken on board. And it's difficult to say how common these cases are, but I've said this before. J. Allen Hynek reportedly said that 1 in 40 people have been on board a UFO. That's a lot. And it was in 1991 that the Roper Organization did a poll and found that 1 in 50 people showed the markers of being a UFO contactee. So the point is, this is happening to millions of people. We now have a database of some tens of thousands of onboard encounters, but you can bet it's a lot more than that. So I hope someday all humanity accepts the fact that these experiences are happening. I think it's really important we take them seriously. We need to move past the skepticism and ridiculing and gaslighting of UFO witnesses and give them a safe space to share their encounters. It's one of the reasons I do this research, because I know a lot of you out there, particularly you who are watching this, have probably had encounters of your own. So I'm presenting this data as objectively and as a facts-only manner as I can, because there's so much misinformation and disinformation and confusion and fear surrounding this subject. It's really unwarranted. It's time that this subject goes mainstream and that we all accept the fact that we are not alone in this universe. And all you have to do is go outside and look at the stars, and it's pretty obvious. There's no way we could be the only ones living on a planet in this vast, practically infinite, as far as we know, universe. So that's it. 7 cases coming from all over the world. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, perhaps learned something. I truly appreciate it. It's because of you guys I'm doing this research and making these episodes. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun in this amazing, infinite universe. I will see you next time. Bye for now.